flat. And it's roughly, we are at these points, we are pushing the boundaries. And I think this, in a way, this is sort of my positive endpoint. This makes us human, I think, pushing the boundaries.
Am I on? Yeah. All right, so until very recently, I think I had, my thought was that I didn't have much to say regarding AI and humanizing AI. Then we had a few discussions with some of the people who are here today and others, and also we decided to participate in a workshop for Kai this year, and we came up with this long and lovely title of Taming a Runaway Object, How to Maintain and Extend Human Control in Human-Computer Interaction. Like Albrecht, my talk is also pretty much situated in the work that we're currently doing in my ERC advanced grant at Aarhus University. The project is called CIO, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later. But I just want to sort of pay tribute to the workshop paper from Kai this year. It's out there online, so if anybody wants to read it, they can. I think I'm giving my own take on it today, basically. I also realize that my talk has some parallels to what Albrecht talked about, and then others not so much. So I think the situation that we're facing right now, and which is actually very much also the motivation for the CIO project that I'm running, called CIO meaning Common Interactive Objects, is that it seems that human-computer interaction or human control over technology is largely challenged today by this renewed focus on AI. Or perhaps not, that's actually maybe one of the questions I'm trying to raise here. So we somehow, I think, need a critical stance to what the potential consequences of this new wave of AI, just like we had it in the 80s when I think the first time we had a real serious discussion about AI and the impacts for society. The nasty me says maybe not so much has actually happened anyway in terms of what AI is today compared to the 80s, but we'll also get back to that. I would, of course, like Albrecht and others, also say that we need to embrace some of the potentially good stuff that's in the current wave of AI. So just a few words about the project, the IC project, that is basically just starting up. So it's called Common Interactive Objects, and I chose the term common to focus on the resources and affordances that has to do with how we as human beings share objects, as well as sort of the collaborative activities around the coming and going of these sharing of objects within communities and across community boundaries. And of course, being a computer scientist, I'm interested in interactivity and interactive objects. And objects, you can say, we choose to think about, or I choose to think about, because they stand between people and also between people and their materials, and because they are malleable or shapeable both in use and in design, but also I think with inspiration, you can say, from Alan Kay's whole idea about the clay of computing, that while these things may be malleable up front, they are also becoming more rigid and more conservative over time. So what we'll do in the project, and we have just started, is both a conceptual foundation, it's also building components, it's studying cases.
Can you just adjust your microphone?
Yes, please. I know, it's a bit annoying, isn't it? And this focus on malleability and control, and shareability is in a sense at the heart of the project. So, like Albrecht, I also have been looking back. I didn't quite maybe go as far back as Licklider and whoever else. But I've sort of lately fallen in love with this old quote from Vinograd and Flores. And I'll like to remind you all now that I mean, Terry Winograd was actually the wonder kid of the first wave of AI, who then, by writing this book together with Fernando Flores that came out in '86, really became very critical towards AI and the possibilities of AI. So instead, in the book that they had in 1986, where they discussed this issue of, you know, what are the limitations of AI, they talk about how tools are fundamental to actions. They say through our actions we generate the world. The transformations we're concerned with in their book is not a technical one, but a continuing evolution of how we understand our surroundings and ourselves, how we continue becoming the beings that we are. And I kind of like the idea that this is about becoming and about technologies and the way technologies impact our possibilities and limitations for becoming in various ways. So of course you can ask the question, you know, what did we become then in the 80s with the first wave of AI? And what do we have a chance or a risk of becoming now? So in a sense, this is what I'm going to talk about. So in a certain way, I guess, I mean, there are some parallels with Albrecht's talk. And to some extent, some of what we were thinking about in that workshop paper we were writing is that and what I'll argue about is in this talk as well, is that somehow this new AI maybe is only still automation as we know it, and we've already known it. And of course, technology keeps automating human activity at a lot of levels. But I'm still open for the idea that maybe there is something special to the new AI after all that we should embrace. While I was actually sitting here listening to Albrecht's talk, I decided to actually add this slide, because I heard a talk by a Danish, or I think he's actually German, economist called Philip Schröder last week, and he presented a project that they'd done in this sort of semi-commercial space, where they talk about the impact of automation in Denmark. And the figure they have here is actually, I think, at a somewhat bigger scale, the answer to Albrecht's question. Because for all income brackets for Denmark, of course, I guess it's like Sweden, but in Denmark they have quite good understandings of, you know, what people are doing, what they're earning, and stuff like that. So it's actually possible to make these statistics. But for all income brackets, they basically calculated how many percentage of the current jobs are currently under the threat or the risk, or whatever you want to call it, of automation. And I think the interesting thing here is that when you look at this, it's actually not the lower paid jobs. It's not the muscle guys. And it's also not the higher paid jobs. Not, of course, there's also still some risk of automation or percentage of jobs that can be, I mean, it's not whole jobs, right? It's work hours that can be automated. But where the big sort of risk of automation is it really in the lower to the middle range paid jobs. And of course, this Philip Schröder guy is just making the argument that really it doesn't matter, because at the sort of national or global scale, we're shifting the jobs. So we're just putting together jobs out of new bits. So it doesn't matter that some of this goes away. But I think in terms of Albrecht's question, it is really interesting that it's not the low-paid manual jobs. It's not the cleaning of the hotel rooms and those things. It's also not the academic jobs, not the thinking jobs, but it's somewhere in the middle that a lot of the current risk or potential for automation is. When we then move a little bit closer to the computer, I think when we look back to the 1980s and the years after that, of course, there was this idea that the computer should somehow be like a human, or we could understand it as if it was a human, or, you know, there are many variations of this. This was, of course, discussed, and Patty Mays and Ben Snyderman had this control delegation debate. I think there was also, in a sense, you can say, this discussion of, you know, is this a human-computer partnership, or is there other ways that we can understand this? And I mean, the way I thought about it then was to think about, in a sense, human partnership through computers more than human-machine partnership. So the computer, the technology as an object, or an artifact in a, why does it say meeting? I hate spelling, in a mediating role. I've also worked to think about situations where it's, of course, just not one computer, one user, but multitudes of computers, multitudes of artifacts that Albrecht was also talking about, many human beings collaborating, working together, and so far, and people who own and share and appropriate and co-develop these technologies. So the question is, in a sense, and was, how to create interactive digital environments that are flexible enough to support appropriation by end users in these multi settings. I would pay tribute to a figure here by Antti and Kasper Hornbeck from Mackay paper a couple of years ago, where they, I mean, there's many ways you can read this figure, but one of them is that they kind of list a couple of these models where you could say the relationship between the human being and the computer is mapped out in human-computer interaction. And you can see it starts with this idea that what there is between a human being and a computer is a dialogue. Then it proposes other ways of thinking about this, some of which are more what I would say the role of mediation, whether it's tool use, it's experience, or it's embodiment. So there are, of course, various ways that these things have been looked upon, and I mean, there's some amount of, I don't know, of historical development slightly in this table, but not entirely. And the question is, of course, how do we look at this now? So I've recently been reading some work by this guy Nicolini, who, with some collaborators, talks about objects, and I think I would like to say here a little bit more about why I talk about objects, and I think it has a relevance for the kind of argument that I want to make. So they understand objects as performing at least 3 types of work. So objects motivate and allow collaboration. Objects allow participants to work across different types of boundaries. Objects constitute the fundamental infrastructure of an activity. They are also multiple, heterogeneous, and potentially conflictual. I took here actually a picture from an old project that I myself was involved with, where you could say this is a prototype of a system that's supposed to help people or parents plan parental leave. So it's both something that can be used to, in a sense, as an actual plan, as a contract with the parents' very employers. It's also something that could be used as negotiating with the employers or with the city, the municipal authorities. It's also something that can be used exploratively between the parents to basically find out how to most optimally set up their joint parental leave period, which is constrained by a large number of rules and regulations, and depending on, I mean, in the Danish system, things like whether you have holidays before the parental leave or after, for instance, has impacts on how much money you will get out if you're that cynical, which I guess I won't blame anybody for being. So I think this is actually, in a sense, an example of an object of this nature where we deliberately try to, in a sense, also work to support these things that Nicolini say are sort of what objects are about. Of course, there are a lot of other people in our area who talked about delegation and automation, and we already heard about automation. I think it's important to say that for me, automation is always something where, in a sense, human activity somehow gets delegated to technologies of various kinds. And of course, we do that all the time. We as human beings delegate to other human beings. We delegate to technologies and systems thereof. So, I mean, for instance, Giddens talked about expert systems. So he talked about the banking systems and the monetary systems of examples of expert systems, which are really delegations, sort of to say that, you know, we have banks and we have money, and they kind of handle that. We don't have to think about it when we give somebody 10 kroner for something or other. So this kind of delegation and these systems that are behind the scenes and sometimes automated, sometimes just handed over. I mean, I guess the cleaning lady in the hotel room is an example of a delegation that certainly isn't very automated, but nonetheless is there. I also, of course, when you talk about communities and activities and boundaries, the term boundary objects often came up. And I think when we talk about AI, it's actually interesting to think that Lee Starr, when she originally talked about boundary objects, she really phrased it very tightly into this debate and discussion about artificial intelligence. So there's sort of two original papers about boundary objects, and one was in the proceedings of one of the early, or maybe not an early, but one of the AI conferences. I think for now I want to say that the way she talked about boundary objects in this work is that they came from inside the community and they are non-hierarchical. And common objects, as she then talked about it later on in 2010, are the stuff of action, but they are also in this tension between flexibility and structure. So I think you can say that objects inside boundaries have these open, malleable, and seamless characteristics, but when they cross boundaries, they are seamful, they resist, they are closed in various ways. I've discussed it with Liam Bannon, but certainly a lot of other people have. Objects play different roles to different users at different points in time, and they have different forms of ownership and are shared in various ways. And now I come to the idea of runaway objects, which again is not something we came up with. It's actually a term that got introduced by Ørje Engström, and I think actually his original work was about open source software. But the idea is that runaway objects are objects that have been modified by many, but are basically under the control of nobody. So you can say that with modern AI, these objects are not only modified by many human beings, they are also modified by algorithms, by statistics in various forms. And I think here it's fair to say, for instance, that my feeling is that the Facebook newsfeed is an example of that, right? Of course, we can see that if we see what we have on Facebook, that we're somewhat impacted by what we ourselves have done in the past, last time we were on or whatever, or what somebody else has done. But there's also other stuff happening behind it that sometimes we can see through, other times not. And I think the whole news bubble discussion is actually, in a sense, maybe one can say that or see that that the sort of our news feed or whatever, that they are really, or these bubbles are really runaway objects. And the question, of course, is whether, in a sense, the new forms of AI gives a qualitative change to this, or it's just a matter of quantity. My next question is, of course, how we can focus on practice and collaboration and build technologies that better support the control over these things. And so basically the title comes from this. Can the runaway interactive objects be tamed by the human users also in these new situations? So, of course, we know that every human activity is involving highly routinized actions. And I was reminded again that there's this very old paper by Lucy Sussman and Ellen Wynne, actually from 1984, where they talked about procedures and problem solving in the office. Where I mean, the interpretation I want to offer just for this is that even in the most routinized kind of settings, people improvise and they solve problems wherever they occur. However, what happens with a lot of these algorithmic objects over time, they've tended to be formalized and leaning on the organizational practices, the organizational routines. And so in a sense you could say that this is somewhat in conflict with the idea that we improvise all the time. And the problem is that when we as human beings delegate to software, trust software systems to mediate our relationships, this delegation actually, in a sense, also means to trust a common understanding between us and the technology that we then maybe don't have, because we understand it as both the structure and the improvisations, whereas the technological solutions are mainly leaning only on the routines and the structure. I also was reminded that in the Boninati's book from 1986, there's a chapter by Boris Velikovsky and Vladimir Stinchenko, where they bring up the idea that in the Russian psychology tradition, Leontiev, for instance, proposed that automation is always based on routines. So basically, the tradition, which is actually close to my own heart, sort of insists that in order to automate anything in the human setting, we first have to have routines for it. So you can say routines are, and I think with other people also, with Sussman and so on, you could also say that routines are also necessary for our activities to develop. Simply again, because we have to delegate, and we have, like Albrecht was also saying, to do things without having to think about them all the time. So maybe the problem that we have with the new AI is that some of these patterns that come out of these new forms of automation really don't reflect these human routines. So it means that we are not, in a sense, able to recognize where this comes from in terms of our human routines and problem solving. And maybe that's where there is a challenge. So you can, in a sense, ask the question of whether it's exactly there where this interpretation and control breaks down, and where, in a sense, the object can no longer be tamed. And of course, it's not rocket science to say that AI just simply does things that are unpredictable and unpredicted. But I think, in a sense, this is a little bit deeper, because we can say a little bit more about what kind of things that are unpredictable here. So I want to propose that in order, in a sense, to continue working with this, We also need to think about what the control and delegation, where it happens. Is it the control that lies with the user or the community of users in use? Is it with the community of users when appropriating and developing the technology in use? Or is it with the creators of the technology who then offer possibilities for the users to further have the control, but also develop their routines of control? So can designers and developers give communities of users the tool to tame their common interactive objects, or can common interactive objects be built to let users learn and develop their use while offering some structure, direction, and stability? When we wrote the Kai workshop paper, we actually started to discuss a paper that was at Kai by Eve's PhD student, Anke van Oosterhout, and her collaborators, where basically they've done a thermostat design. And again, this is kind of maybe my slightly oversimplified version of what this thing does. But it is a shape-changing thermostat that basically conveys action possibilities to the users, while the haptic feedback lets the users sense the system's willingness to submit to the user's choices. So I think there are examples where somehow we can actually manage to give this malleability and sense of what can be tamed and what cannot be tamed back to the users. And this is actually, I think, one of the examples of this. And my very last slide, however, is this one. And so in a sense, I think that the questions you can ask based on this is, can AI better reveal to users the assumptions it's making regarding human routines? Can we give the users tools to overrule these assumptions? Can AI step down when needed? I think that's actually an interesting question. And will we as human beings then be able to step in? And in a sense, can the runaway interactive objects be tamed by their human users? I actually put this picture here not because it has very much to do with AI, but I think it says a lot about how human beings appropriate the technologies that are built for totally different things. So this is a picture that Ole Iversen, my colleague, took from a school class somewhere in Denmark, where they're using a smart board and another fancy technology, namely big post-it notes. So they posted on the smart board these lists. I think it's actually lists of Danish cities. I don't know what they've been doing in class. But this is, of course, a totally maybe unpredictable way of appropriating the technology like smart boards, or maybe the technology of smart boards together with the technology of post-it notes, which, by the way, is celebrating its 50th birthday this year. I'll end it there.
Questions? I'll jump in with one while you're thinking about that. So Susanne, I think what I really like in your talk is this link back to one of the foundation parts of HCI, which is, of course, activity theory. And I think the thing I take from that that's most relevant here is, and also this, I think, your slide from Anti's work. There's just a whole range of different ways that we use objects. We wear objects, we drink from a bottle, and I think there's this temptation sometimes to try and want to sort of put them on a scale and say, oh, look, they all fit in this nice order, but how much we're actually paying attention to them and how much we're not. And clearly that's just very much richer. So I think, what do you think is wrong with how we're thinking about this object relation right now?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that they can't. They come and go. I mean, objects come and go to us, right? But I think they come and go between us as human beings as well. So I think in a sense, when you have Albrecht's slide of the stuff that a particular human being has touched, right? It's of course interesting from one perspective, but I'm actually, in a sense, much more interested in what are the objects that people then configure around together, and that I think can be over time and in very different capacities. And I think there's something which is also a dialectical relationship that I think we've somehow, it's moved out of focus a little bit with a lot of these discussions that people are also having about objects. But there are certainly also, at least when we talk about digital ones, they do have this capacity of being shaped and reshaped as they get used. And I'm very interested in what is it in particular with the technology that supports or hinders that. I mean, I think we do it with all kinds of objects, but we don't design buildings and stuff. So we do design technologies.
Sorry, Barry. So I have two comments. I really like how it connected to Albrecht's speech before you and how it's all about control. But and I like the idea of taming the objects. But the two things I was thinking about. One is the commercial reality out there, that a lot of these things are people going to put a lot of money into, and then maybe we can have these wonderful, beautiful, tamed objects and so on. But then there are other areas where there's not a lot of money, and they're going to have shitty AI in them. And just watching all the videos of people trying to tame their Alexa. I saw somebody with a Scottish accent trying to get Alexa to do something, and there's not enough money to, perhaps yet, to make Alexa use a Scottish accent and actually understand that. And so who's going to invest money into that? Why is it worthwhile? The commercial realities of where this is going to happen. And so I liked your connection to the organization and where is the money and where is the professions that have the money to do the tamed objects, the beautiful ones, the ones that we're going to love and have in our lives. And the other thing you didn't mention is how once we have these things, they're de-skilling us. So even though we might want to have control, we no longer have the skill. So, you have the autonomous car, and then suddenly you're supposed to take over, but you haven't driven your car for bloody 3 years. You have no idea how to take over in a situation of emergency. And so what is that? Are we really going to have this beautiful future with these tamed objects?
Yeah, as for the latter discussion first, I think that discussion is actually going back to the automation and AI discussion in the 80s as well, right? And if you think about how people who worked with the power plant and other kind of control rooms like Jens Rasmussen at Risø and other people, how they thought about it, I think it is that they were exactly concerned with how you would also preserve your manual routines when these things happen. And I think, I mean, even I in the Aarhus conference in 1985, there was this paper by Maja-Lisa Perby from the Swedish Center for Working Life talking about meteorologists and their models. And she made the point that sometimes meteorologists look out the window, right? Because when, it's quite likely that if you look out and the sun is shining, that's actually a good suggestion for the forecast, right? It doesn't mean that they don't do all these other things, but it means that they, it kind of have that, there's a ground truth somehow that after all, you wouldn't say, if somebody predicted snow for Stockholm for tomorrow, right? Yeah, and so I think there is a concern there, but that's a really old concern and discussion. I think they, when it came to these industrial and power plant control room settings, there were people who were setting up ways in which one could then think about keeping some of these routines as fallback options. I do agree with you that does not stick its head out very much in these go by your Alexa and other things. I think it is interesting with this whole consumer technology kind of sector, and I did talk about it in my 3 Waves paper back whenever that was, this idea of how difficult or easy it is to influence the kind of technologies we're getting when we're just going out there and buying technologies. It, of course, could be and would be possibly quite interesting if there were other ways in which one could shape Alexa so that it would actually work for you and not just for your Queen's English speaking person or whatever it is, American, maybe more likely, right? It is this tricky thing, I think, with consumer technology where it doesn't seem to, I don't know, maybe they're not considering it, or maybe there is no money in it if you make more advanced versions of these. I think if you start to analyze some of these technologies, and I don't have a good example, you will see that for some, after all, some things have improved from when the first versions came out in terms of having better possibilities of reshaping and controlling.
Okay, thank you for your talk. Runaway objects have been modified by many, but under the control of nobody, you said, or quoting Engström. Don't runaway objects then acquit or absolve responsibility from everyone? So do we have a dilemma of consequence, I wonder?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. It's a really good question. I like the way Engström makes these analyses, for instance, of open source software and how it builds on things. And I think it can be applied analytically to a lot of other examples. You know, I haven't thought through what it means if we're also sort of thinking about them more, how can you say it, more prescriptively, or thinking about what they could be or what they should be, you know. But I think it's a really relevant question, as you were saying, yeah.